So how do we build on 2FA? And I want to, go back to what for some of us might be a little bit rudimentary, for some others might be very new, but the discussion of factors versus attributes. And what do we mean when we use these terms? When we say two-factor authentication, what are we technically talking about versus what might be in there? The English word factor is different from what we might mean when we say factor in security sense. So factors are the category of identifying an individual with something like a password, like a PIN, any number of things like that. This is something that you could be stored in your brain. It could be stored in your password manager or whatever, but it's an ongoing piece of information. This would also include perhaps like those security questions that you get when you're in a system and they say, hey, what was your first dog's name? And you say, Fifi. Don't do that. Quick side trip piece of advice. When they're asking security questions, make up different answers that aren't even true. Don't let someone social engineer your security questions. Make up stuff that's not true, record it, keep it safe, know what answer you gave. And then when they say, what's your favorite movie? And the actual response is 123 Main Street, no one can ever guess what it is. But security questions are themselves something you know. Something you have is the standard multi-factor code or similar, a token key that you might have on you or something like that. It's a changing code, so it's not just a static thing. It's not something that you just know in your brain. It's going to be changing based on the algorithm that's there. It's a certificate that you have to be able to provide. And then something you are, we get into biometrics, right? So eye scans, fingerprint scans, all that kind of fun stuff. These are what we call factors. They are specific to an individual. They aren't things that just anyone can have, unless, of course, they're compromised. But no one else has my fingerprint on them all the time, unless they manage to steal it. No one else has my eyeballs. No one else has my passwords. By contrast, attributes, there are other restrictions that are in the category of attributes, but they aren't specifically identifying an individual. The category of something you can do, maybe it's a swipe code you can do on your phone or a special dance you can do, whatever it might be. Something you can exhibit like an IT badge. Someone who perhaps you don't have your own security, but when you come up into the building, there is someone who comes down to let you into the meeting. And they're able to get you the visitor badge, bring you in. Someone is one of the potential attributes we deal with. And then somewhere you are. And I put somewhere you are last because that's the main thing I want to turn our attention to in a minute. But as you think through these categories of factors and attributes, part of the thing is this is a world of opportunity here for us as IT professionals to build on two-factor auth, to get to a true multi-factor auth where the system needs more than just a username and a password and a two-factor code, or a username and password and some other additional thing that we've put there for the second factor. But instead, we're able to lock it down more than that. We're able to make it more restricted so that when bad actors get in, they can't get in because now there's something else still stopping them. And the more this can be something that can't be stolen or easily reproduced, the better, because then it makes it increasingly difficult to be able to get into the system. So somewhere you are brings me to the topic of IP whitelisting. I think this is a very powerful authentication attribute, as I say there on the slide. And what I don't mean is blocking geolocations in a blacklist where it says, everyone who's not in the United States can't get to my system. As we have seen many times, and as many of you might be thinking, bad actors don't generally show that they're coming from a foreign country when they're coming across. They set up some temporary VM that's on Azure infrastructure in the US or AWS infrastructure in the US or whatever when they're attacking the US. You can't block someone from coming within the trusted space if they're already in the trusted space. So that is a thing we can do, but it is not going to stop someone from getting into your system if they're already using an IP in the correct range. What I'm talking about instead is whitelisting. Only those who are approved are allowed to use the system. This is something that requires management. It requires human processing and management to deal with it, which I want to dive into a little bit in a minute. And it is something that is shackles. Like I have limited myself and locked myself out of our system sometimes by putting this in place in some cases. And I've had to find ways to make sure that I can adjust that when needed, that my coworkers can help me get in if I'm currently locked out. If my IP address changes on the system I'm on, if I have to change to a hotspot or whatever else, I have to be able to update the IP that's in the whitelist so I can still use systems. It is harder. I will make no qualms about that. If anyone has accusations that this is making security more difficult, it's true. The benefit is, if the only place that you can get into my system is from my IP address, then you can get my password, you can get my two-factor code, you can get whatever else you want. And unless you're able to get to my location, be where I currently am, you can't get to my system. And when we're dealing with people who are remote bad actors, in many cases, we're not dealing with someone who has now walked into your office. Obviously, if someone has, they'd get past IP whitelisting. Different factors would come into play there. But as we're dealing more and more with cloud tools, as we're dealing more and more with a cloud attack surface that can be hit from anywhere, and as we're dealing more and more with, kind of drive-by attacks, so to speak, and just throw it out to the whole group and see who happens to respond with credentials so I can go blast anyone who will listen, anyone who will fall compromised to this. The more we're dealing with that, the more we're dealing with people who are not on your site. They aren't coming into your office, into your system. So the more that we can lock down and say, hey, only from this location and that location and this other location are you allowed to use this system at all, we can lock bad actors out of our systems. So that's part of the goal in this talk, is to think through IP whitelisting in specific. And so what does that actually look like, though? This is a screenshot of a tool called Addigy. And some of you might be familiar, some of you might not, but Addigy is an MDM for Apple devices. You get the settings in place so that the Addigy system is approved to help manage the Apple devices, whether it's iPhones or iPads or laptops or desktops or anything in the Apple infrastructure. And Addigy will help manage it. All the different supervisory mode options you might have with any of the other MDM systems, Addigy will handle. With Addigy, we can go into the account settings, and you can see there some default grayed out IP address options in that box. But this is the box right there. You just take that allow list, comma separate a bunch of IPv4 addresses or CIDRs, and now only these IP addresses would even be allowed to get to ArcSource's instance of Addigy, whatever I would put into that IP address box. It's as simple as that in many ways. Like, go into the settings, go to the spot, put it in place. That's what it looks like in Addigy. By contrast, this is what it looks like in Datto RMM, which is a tool that we use as a managed service provider on a regular basis. Get into the administrative settings, and there's an option right there. Turn on IP address restrictions, and then put in the restricted IP address list. Enter a list of IP addresses, one on each line. You'll notice one of the problems with both of these is that neither one has a place to put notes or description of which IP addresses there are, which I'll get to in a minute in terms of how we manage that. This is a screenshot of Keeper Password Manager. In Keeper, you can set up roles and you can set up groups and all of that. And one of the things you can do is edit the enforcement policies for the groups that are in play. And within the enforcement policies, we have this option to say, hey, restrict the vault access to just these IP addresses. AWS also has this in the security groups. You get in your EC2 instance or whatever else, and you set up your security group, and you can say, hey, traffic that's coming from this source and only this source is allowed to get in. So in my wonderful demo test here, on the demo test IP whitelist, we have this made up IP address, 92.218.45.2/32. /32 means only this IP address, not a range, right? Now, if we wanted to, we could have an IP range instead. If there's 13 different static IP addresses you might come out of from your office or that sort of thing, you could set that up. You could also make it protocol or port range specific. So we can do TCP only, UDP only, set the port ranges that apply. So if we know that we only need to come to this system on port 8433 or 8443 or 80 or whatever port we're going to do, we can lock it down that much and say only these IP addresses and only on these ports. In many ways, these are not revolutionary concepts, right? These are security industry things that have been around. But taking and using these to intentionally put in shackles and restrictions on ourselves so that we are more secure as a result, so that we are able to lock down systems more than we otherwise would be able to, and making sure in that regard that bad actors can't break into our systems. They break into our systems, they break into a lot more powerful payload than they would if they just get to one of the end users. So Addigy, Datto, Keeper, and Amazon Web Services, those four are four systems that I wanted to bring up as just kind of demos showing what it looks like. As long as a vendor has this functionality, we can use it. Which brings to one of the problems in my mind of many vendors at this point are not providing many options. When we look at the tools that are there, the level of security resourcing that's there, the permission groups that are available, the granularity or lack thereof of roles and groups that are in the system. I've seen many systems that you're either an admin or you're not. Or maybe you're an admin or a sort of admin or you're not. And when you say, well, how do I get granular permissions in this? Oh, well, you can't. But here's how these 4 systems work, these 4 roles work that you're given. We need, in many cases, for vendors to step up their game. We also need, in many cases, for us to challenge the vendors that we're talking to say, hey, this tool sounds cool, but what are you going to do to enable greater levels of security to be able to make it so that I now can bring your tool in play and not have your tool become a new point of weakness, not have your tool become the way that we get compromised later on because a bad actor is able to get into it and whitelist their activities. And now your tool is approving the bad activities, for example. There's an opportunity for us to call ourselves, to call the industry, to call vendors who are providing tools to step up their game and to step up our game as a whole as we go through these things. Now, I mentioned earlier, doing IP whitelisting like this, I recognize is intensive. It requires labor, it requires tracking. This screenshot of Amazon Web Services, you can see the description, which is great because on that description, you can list, here's what this IP address is actually for. But in many cases, including the other 3 that I showed, you can't see what it's for. It's just, here's the whitelist of the IP that's allowed. What we have done in terms of how we handle this is switching over just to a spreadsheet. Here's what we're going to track. I made a kind of a generic template version of it to review here with you and point out in many ways how simple it can be to track this, but also, yes, labor intensive, and we have to have some rigor about it to do it. So for example, if we were saying, hey, here's this tool that I'm using, maybe it's the wireless system, maybe it's the app that I'm hosting online or whatever it might be. And based on that tool and the port number of whatever, we're going to track which customers have access to it or which site or location. And in this case, you can see like the idea being if it's hosted in AWS firewall, we just, get those existing rules and throw them in here. But tracking, hey, here's what it's for, right? This is nothing revolutionary. It's a spreadsheet. But saying this is how I'm going to track what goes where so that when I look at this IP address and it's decontextualized in the system, I still know, okay, that was the thing for this. That's still useful. Later on, I can review and go, hey, that IP address is no longer necessary. We can get rid of it. When I'm offboarding and onboarding systems, I can use records like this to make sure that I still know what I'm allowing, what I'm disallowing into the system. Or perhaps I have vendors or other external IPs. Maybe it's for outsourced IT. Maybe it's for a collaboration firm or an integration tool of some sort. List out the IP addresses that they need. List out which systems we're talking about. Do they get access to system 1 and system 2? Do they get access just one to the other? What kind of access are they given and for what purpose? Obviously, this sheet is not implementing those changes, but this is how we can track it in a centralized way to make sure that when we're looking at the other system, it's not confusing to us. Or listing out my own team. And as I'm going through, which IP addresses does my team need to have whitelisted in order to use the tools that we're using? So again, those 4 examples, I'll throw them across the top for AWS, Keeper, RMM, Addigy, another system. Is this IP address temporary? Yes or no, right? If we're going away to Christmas or some other holiday, going on vacation maybe even, and going to do a little bit of work. And so here's this temporary IP address that I'm using for 3 days or 4 days, listing it in there, throwing in a ticket number where I'm tracking it, throwing in a calendar entry that's reminding me to take it off, whatever it might be. This is a temporary IP address. I want it to be available to get access to the tool, but I also want to take it away not too long thereafter. Or doing a separate thing for a vendor or customer, user, specific contact for a person. So maybe the CEO's home office, maybe someone else's. Maybe one of the techs is out in the field and needs to use a hotspot right now, or they're using some extra connection at the office they're checking in at right now. And we can put in that IP address, track what it's for. Maybe this is for a particular contact within a department or at an MSP customer or technical contact who does certain things at times, wants to review the systems that are there. Any number of people. The main point being, however you organize a sheet like this, or whether you use some other tool rather than a spreadsheet, the goal is that we can track and know what is the purpose of each of these IP addresses. Why is it there? Why did I want it to be there? When should it go away if it should? How can I make sure that I know what's going on? From there, switching back over to the main part of the presentation. So we have the tools, if they have the possibility of IP whitelisting. We have a way of tracking what the IPs themselves are. That's the point here in terms of going beyond 2 factors. We have to think creatively. So IP whitelisting is one of the examples I would cite as what I believe to be a powerful attribute in our favor that we can use to help limit things. There are other ideas. So let's get clever. Let's have fun. Let's think through how can we effectively limit the systems that we're using. When I was weightlifting in the past for sports, there was always a certain pain that would come the next day. Any of you who currently weightlift know exactly what it's like. You have leg day and now you can no longer stand or sit appropriately. You just fall constantly the next day as you're walking around. Or you've got arm day and you can barely write with a pencil because your muscles are twitching. And that pain, that annoyance felt good, not because it inherently felt good, but because your brain knew it was building muscle. And that was the whole point of what you were doing in the first place. And I would encourage us to think that way about security limitations we can put in place, that when there's a little bit of pain to doing things the secure way, that instead of being annoying, it can be encouraging. I'm doing something that's helping to keep me away from compromise. Rather than being annoying and wanting to open it up and forget it, I can still keep it restricted. I can work around it. I can learn to work with it and thereby have a more secure, more hardened IT operation as a whole. So I'd call us to a gut check on that regard. Like, how much does annoyance drive our decision-making rather than seeking to avoid compromise and finding ways that will not lead to vulnerabilities? As I said earlier, take yourself seriously. You're an IT professional, you're in IT operations, you're serving a large corporation, you're serving a bunch of different customers like I do at an MSP. Whatever you might be doing, you're in a position of knowledge, you're in a position of, to some degree, authority on these things. You're the person who's studying, who's reading the white papers, who's seeing the news articles about the breaches that happen. Don't pretend like you're just going to have it. Sort it out. Make sure that you're actually taking it seriously enough to care, taking it seriously enough to dive in on these things. If we operate with an assume breach mentality, it can also help us to think through, what is someone going to get if they do get into my system? How can I limit the nature of what they would get when they get into my system? How can I make sure that if they get into this part of the system, there's nothing particularly important there and all the important stuff is in a much better locked down system? So in the example that, I'm showing Keeper has IP address restrictions. Well, if I can IP whitelist that system and I can get behind two-factor on that system also, and so I've got a couple factors and I've got an attribute and maybe more, does Keeper become my most locked down source? If so, then perhaps Keeper becomes the place where the most important information ends up residing. And then other lesser important information is able to stay on a different system, perhaps, because if someone breaches that system, it's not going to be as high of an impact. We can't hope that every single system is going to have the ideal scenario of authentication factors, the ideal scenario of security options. But what we can do is we can take the important information and move it to the most secure place that we can to help make sure that those things can't be hacked, can't be breached, can't be leaked out to the public, can't be a source of weakness for your company or for your customers. And I would encourage you to talk to red teamers for ideas. It's actually a lot of fun. And be like, hey, how would you hack this? How would you break into this? Or even, what would make your life so much harder as a red teamer? What would annoy you when you get into a system and then you discover that this is in place? What would actually be a problem? I think there's a lot of things that it's easy to think that we're super smart and clever, and then discover, oh, that was actually not all that useful and it was easy to break, and the logistical impact was difficult, but the actual benefit in terms of security was not all that helpful. So talking to red teamers for ideas is a great way to kind of sort through ideas, bounce ideas off people, think through what can really help here. Some other ideas that could be talked about in this overall category of IT hardening would include stuff like certificate-based authentication, or the benefits of using a high security single sign-on platform. One that you have multiple factors to lock it down, and then you can do single sign-on on other systems. So they're effectively, to some degree, behind that single sign-on platform's extra degrees of security. Zero trusting your network as a whole. There's no reason that workstation A needs to talk to workstation B. Okay, well, don't let them talk to each other. You can prevent lateral movement by doing that. You can prevent the opportunity for a bad actor to be able to get more information, to get more footholds once they're in. Take third-party risk very seriously. I think this is, especially the more vendor tools that we're getting, the more opportunities that we're getting to provide efficiency by having someone else assist with the work, to make things more scalable because they have a whole team of people doing this thing that I only need a little bit of attention on, any number of things. The more we're bringing in third-party vendors and their security risk becomes ours. We need to be very careful not to just be so eager to jump at the bit and buy the new thing or implement the new thing that we bring in security holes that we didn't realize were there. Someone says they have a SOC 2 compliance form that you can read online. That's all well and good. Have you read it? do they have a process for remaining SOC 2 compliant, or did they just happen to get things in place for that one audit that happened, and now they got a form they can point you to? We need to be cynical enough to ask the questions to confirm, what does our attack surface really look like? What risk are we bringing in with a third party? Keep up with the actual best practices of the industry. It's very easy to decide. For example, I've been doing IT for 20 years. Something that I learned 20 years ago might have no applicability at all at this point. If you think even of using WEP with wireless, anyone who's still using WEP is using an encryption method that can be hacked in a matter of minutes, if not seconds. But back in the late 90s, early 2000s, like, that was the thing. WEP was awesome. It was a way to make sure that you didn't have an open wireless network. So if I'm still now telling someone to use WEP for their authentication encryption on a wireless system, I'm not helping them. Even if I say, oh, it's a best practice. Well, it's a best practice from 20 years ago, bud. So I need to be careful that what I call a best practice is actually best practice. We need to stay up with what is new, what has changed, what needs to be accomplished. And then to that end, we need to train our people. And this is huge. It's so easy to coast along, and people are only trained as much as they might happen to care about, or they are only trained as much as they do in their personal time or whatever. If we really care about security as an IT operations, as a company, managed service providers that are literally IT operations as a company, if we actually care about security, we must train our people, and we must get our people to pursue training so that we know more, so that we are better equipped to take on the environment that we find, the IT landscape that we find, so that we are better equipped to have new ideas and new ways of keeping ahead of bad actors, rather than constantly trailing behind and hoping we just are in a low enough percentage that we don't get hit. If we're operating based on, I sure hope it doesn't happen, then there's a sure sign that we're not in a good space. So those are other ideas that I had already in terms of priming the pot. Now is time for Q&A, sarcastic remarks, and anything else. Hopefully we'll have lots of fun chatting about whatever is there, because that's generally the gist of what I had to present here. It is not highly complex. It's implementing a new attribute that you might not be using. Maybe in some cases people are, in which case, awesome. And it's taking that kind of thinking to say, how else can I lock down things? How else can I make sure that my operations are hard rather than weak, and letting people through?
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out part 3 of this series. Coming up next.